Glad you're with us this morning. My name is Phil, and this is the final week of a series we've been in the month of January called Break Up with Your Phone. And so quick review. So first Sunday of the year, the big idea was there are some practices that are beneficial and there are other practices that are enslaving, and it's really important to know the difference. Second week, we talked about that as great as technology is and as great as our phones specifically are, they do have a hidden agenda. And we talked a lot about the engineering behind the phone and that the agenda is actually addiction. The longer you can look at that screen over the long haul, the more money that companies make. And then last week we talked about the blessing of solitude. And so as we lead up to the end of this series, we're leading up to an event this coming weekend, and I just want to ask you, do you think you have the discipline to turn your phone off for 24 hours? Scripture talks about fasting quite a bit. They didn't fast from phones back then, but they fasted from food all the time. And the reason they did that is because it created space for them to have a stronger attachment towards their Heavenly Father. Well, it's the same principle with you and I. Do you have the discipline to turn your phone off for 24 hours? Each week I've issued a challenge about things you can do with your phone to have a healthier relationship. And so this week, this is the big end of the challenge, breaking up with your phone and turning it off for 24 hours. I understand that some of you have jobs that it simply doesn't allow you to do this, and that's totally fine. But if you don't, I challenge you to do this. Now, if you do, you're going to have to prepare. Number one, that means you're going to probably need to be in contact or communication earlier in the week with friends or family that you might need to get a hold of on the weekend and set up an alternate means of communication. It's really important. The second thing you're going to have to do if you're going to prepare and actually try this is you're really going to have to be intentional about what you're going to do. You're going to have to replace the time that you would have spent on your phone doing something else. So last fall, 10 people from this congregation went through this challenge. They did a lot of things for about a month on their phones with apps, trying to be aware of how much time they were spending, but this culminated in a 24-hour fast. And I wanted you to hear from them some of the things that they did with their freed up time. So watch this quick video.
I started reading a book, which is crazy because it's something I used to always do, but now I always say that I don't have time. But whenever I wasn't on my phone, I realized how much time I actually had. And so I really enjoyed it. I was able to start reading again.
I got really efficient with my homework just because, there's nothing distracting me and getting in the way. I don't really care if my phone dings,
I learned Piano Man on the piano, so I was very excited. So I haven't played piano for a long time, and it was because I just thought that I didn't have time to, and I was like, oh wow, I have a couple hours a day now to do this, so it was fun.
I was able to spend more time actually talking to my wife. I know what you're thinking, but I look at my phone, so I don't have to talk to my wife. But as it turns out, communication is important to a marriage.
I felt a lot more focused and productive, less scrambled and stressed trying to get all the things done, because I was kind of more clear-headed, okay, without my phone distracting me, I know I need to do this, 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 and this, and I'm not going to waste time scrolling through things that I don't need to be doing. So I felt like I was able to make a list and check it off a lot quicker than I normally do.
I had the same experience. I did more intentional the things, tasks, or communicating with my husband. I found myself deciding to use that time to talk to God, or to write thank you notes or encouraging notes to people. And I just went much more intentional in what I did instead of mindlessly being entertained, which is what I got caught up in.
I was able to step out of my comfort zone too, specifically at school, because normally in between classes I just play a game until the next class starts or something, but whenever I wasn't, I was talking to more people. I was having more conversations, and I was talking to people that I wouldn't normally talk to, so I was making more friends, but also the relationships that I already had, I could tell were being strengthened because we weren't just sitting side by side not talking. We were actually having meaningful conversations and learning about each other.
Breaking up with my phone allowed me to hear God through all the noise.
Breaking up with my phone allowed me to step out of my comfort zone.
Breaking up with my phone helped me to focus and see the world around me.
Breaking up with my phone made the relationships in my life stronger.
Breaking up with my phone allowed me to be less distracted and more productive.
Breaking up with my phone helped me reconnect with God's creation.
Breaking up with my phone allowed me to let go of information I didn't need.
Breaking up with my phone felt better than Phil's Easter Sunday sermon.
Thank you, Sam, for that wonderful comic relief. Well, I hope you enjoyed hearing what they did. A lot of pretty cool things. Face-to-face conversation, playing the piano, and it'll be the same with you. If you want to turn your phone off for 24 hours, you're going to have to make a plan. So, last thing I'll say about this is Saturday evening, we're doing an event called FaceTime. So if you can, we'd love you to sequence your phone fast from Friday night to Saturday night, and then come up to the summit, and we're just going to hang out for 2 hours. It's MRCC game night. So bring your favorite game. We'll have inflatables up in the gym for the kids. There's a coffee company called the Landing Coffee Company, which will have coffee. And we want you to bring whatever your game is, and then we'll just hang out for a few hours. And at the end of that, we're going to break our fast together by using our phones in a really meaningful way. Because as I've said nearly every week, it's not that the phones themselves are evil or wrong. It's our relationship with them. In fact, our phones can be one of the greatest tools for love and blessing others. Some of the greatest pieces of encouragement I have ever received have been from some of you, and they've been via text messages or emails. So it's not that technology is bad, it's our relationship with it. And so go 24 hours without your phone, come here on Saturday, and then we have a meaningful way we want to show you to break our fast with our phones. If I had to summarize the whole series into one sentence, it would be this: use your phone purposefully, not passively. Use it purposefully, not passively. Question I want you to think about before we hop into a passage today, which by the way will be Luke chapter 8. I want you to think about a time in your life when you felt loved deeply by somebody else. Not talking about romantic love. I'm talking about some experience that you had with somebody else or a group of people where you felt deep down that this person or this group of people really, really cares about me. Now, if we answer this question, if every single person could take a crack at this question, my guess is there would be a lot of common themes about this particular question. And if I had to guess, I would say 2 of the top 4 or 5 themes would be this. Number 1, a lot of you would tell stories about a time when somebody showed up in your life unexpectedly. So you would say, a time when I felt loved is when I got married, and I didn't think that so-and-so was going to show up, but then they were there. Or that one time I was in the hospital and the door opened and I couldn't believe my eyes when so-and-so walked through that door. My heart about leapt out of my chest. We feel really loved when people show up in our lives unexpectedly. A second theme that would probably emerge is a lot of you would tell stories about somebody deeply listening to you without judgment. You would tell stories about some person that came into your life and sat down with you and just listened to you. Deep listening. I have a lot of stories I could tell about people in the room that have done this for me, but I'll use someone outside our church context. So several years ago, I met a man at a seminar. He works for a sister university. And first time I met this guy, his name's Jim. We sat down for coffee. And for 45 minutes, he sustained genuine interest in my life. Never switched the conversation back to himself, and if he did, it was in order to bless me. He was pleasant. There was no agenda. There was no judgment. It was just pure, genuine interest and love for 45 minutes, and I remembered it. I felt loved. Now, what's the commonality between people showing up in your life unexpectedly and people listening to you deeply? Well, the commonality is something called the power of presence. It's the ability for somebody to stand in your life and simply be fully present to you. And do you know the greatest enemy of presence? The greatest enemy of presence is the presence of distraction. You cannot be fully present to somebody else in your life when you are distracted. And so what I want to talk about for a few minutes is simply this: how can we get better at offering the simple, pure gift of presence to our friends, to our families, to our coworkers. I want to begin by talking about hygiene codes. Who is a germaphobe? Raise your hand if you're a germaphobe. If you just can't stand germs, really bothers you. So some of you, most of you are not germaphobes then. So modern day, we have ways of dealing with hygiene and dealing with germs. So we'll wash our hands, and that's one way we deal with it. We'll cough in our elbows. If you're sick, you go home from work. If your child is sick, you send your child. 2,000 years ago, they did not deal with hygiene those ways. Soap was not even invented till the Middle Ages. And so in ancient times, the main way that people stayed hygienic was one principle: avoidance. In fact, if you go read your Old Testament, a lot of the laws in the Old Testament are about how to avoid people and situations which might make you sick. So, for example, Leviticus chapter 15, the entire chapter is devoted to how you can make sure to stay away from people who are bleeding. Numbers 19 is another interesting chapter in the Old Testament. It's a chapter about what do you do to stay away from corpses. In fact, Numbers 19, just to show you how grave the situation was, at least in the Old Testament, if you were to touch a corpse and you didn't go through the purification rituals that the Old Testament prescribed for you to do, then Numbers 19 says that you shall be cut off from Israel. So this was a huge deal, especially in the Old Testament and around the time of Christ. And you can't blame these people, because if you get sick, you take medicine, you go to the doctor, you get medicine, you get better. But if they got sick back then, more often than not, if they got sick, it was a good chance that they would die. And so what this meant was they had to be really, really strict with their hygiene codes. And so number one, this meant you don't touch blood. You don't touch people that are bleeding. Number two, this meant you do not touch corpses. And number three, an implication of the first two is that you be really careful if you're in large crowds of people. So be careful of bodies, be careful of blood, and be careful of crowds. So here's what I want to do. I want to read a passage, Luke chapter 8, and I would like you to, for a moment, be the hygiene police. And so here's your job as the hygiene police. If I read something in this passage that makes you think, you know what, there's a little bit of danger there, then all I want you to do, actually, I haven't fully decided how I want this to happen. So quick test here. Can everybody whistle on the count of three? Like an alarming, like, oh, don't do that whistle. I want to see how good you do. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay, that's good enough. We're going with that. Okay, so as I read this, if you hear something and you're like, no, he shouldn't do that, that's bad, then I just want you to do what you just did. Luke chapter 8, verse 40. Now when Jesus, remember, we got bodies, blood, and crowds. Those are all the bad things. Okay, here we go. Verse 40. When Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him. Very good, very good. For they were expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, the synagogue ruler, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. Okay, a few more of you need to do this. Not a lot of you are doing this, but I might have to switch tactics halfway through. Okay. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. Very good, very good. Okay. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Good, good. But no one could heal her. She came up behind him and she touched the edge of his cloak. It's terrible. You don't have to whistle on that one. I'm just reading the Bible. Only whistle if you feel there's danger. So I'll summarize the next part of the story. Jesus heals the woman bleeding, and then he goes to Jairus' house, and he actually heals the girl. But here's the last verse, or one of the last verses of the story. But he took her by the hand. There you go. And said, "My child, get up." So all this to say, Luke chapter 8 violates so many codes from the Old Testament. Jesus was in grave danger all throughout this story. He touched bodies. He touched this bleeding woman. He is surrounded by this crowd. And yet the strange thing is Jesus doesn't get hurt by any of it. So here's what I want to share with you. 2 principles from this story that Jesus demonstrates. The first thing that Jesus demonstrates is something called reverse contamination. Author Richard Beck wrote about this years ago, and I love what he says about it. So my ideas that I'm about to share with you come from him. So here's how the law of contamination works. I think there's a slide that says something about contamination. I think, if you hit the next slide. Maybe not. Okay, so this is a bottle of water. It's pure water. In fact, I'll take a drink of it right now. So the way that the law of contamination works is in this little container. And so if I put a drop or two of gasoline in this bottle of water, would anybody feel comfortable? Whew, that's strong. I can smell that right now. Wow. Of course not. Because this is how the law of contamination works. The water does not purify the gasoline contaminates the water. So what is evil always contaminates what is pure. If you're eating an apple and you throw the apple away in a public trash can, you're not going to fish the apple out and say, well, it only touched this part of the apple, I'm going to eat the rest. Purify the trash. If you're walking in a park and you happen to step in a mess, the mess does not purify your shoe. Oh, no, your shoe doesn't purify the mess. Your shoe does not purify the mess contaminates the shoe. This is how the law of contamination works. So in the Old Testament, a corpse contaminated the person that touched it. The blood would contaminate the person that came into contact with it. That's how the law of contamination works. And so here's what's so astonishing about Jesus. Jesus is so pure and he's so holy that not only is he immune to contamination, he reverses it. So he makes the law work backwards. Like his purity actually infects the disease, and his hope overwhelms the despair. Jesus' love destroys the hate. His life afflicts the death. Well, this is really good news, by the way, for you and I, because what this means is that there is not a single thing that you can do to overpower the holiness of Christ. In other words, his holiness is more dominant than your sinfulness. And so for those of you that feel the weight on your shoulders today of regret because of something that you have done, rest assured there is not a single thing that you can do to keep the love of Christ away from your life. His love's powerful. It will go into the heartache, into the sickness, into the disease, and eradicate it from your life. That's how powerful the grace of Christ is. There is no evil dark enough to discredit the power of the gospel. That's the first thing Jesus does in this story. He demonstrates reverse contamination. Here's the second thing Jesus demonstrates. He demonstrates the power of presence. Jesus did not just offer his healing in the story. Jesus offered his very self. He offered his presence. You see, Jesus could have easily done these healings from a distance. He could have noticed the woman coming to him from a distance and said, you know what, you just stay right there. I'm going to say the word and you're healed. And when Jairus came up to Jesus and said, hey, my daughter is sick and dying, Jesus could have said, no problem. I'll just say the word and she'll get better. Because Jesus does that in other places in the Bible. But in this story, the most dominant theme in the story is presence. Did you notice that touch is in both healings? So the woman touches the edge of Jesus' cloak, and Jesus doesn't tell her to go away. And then Jesus actually grabs the girl's hand, the corpse's hand, and raises her up. So presence is very dominant in the story. But not only does Jesus offer these people his touch, he also offers them his time. So think about this. As the crowd moves towards Jairus' house, this would be like an ambulance responding to a 911 call. Somebody's dying. Like Jesus needs to move pretty quick. Like this is not something that you just kind of lolly around trying to get there when you can. This girl's dying, and yet when the woman shows up, the bleeding woman and interrupts this 911 ambulance call. I love the way that Matthew says it in his gospel. He says, Jesus turned and saw her. He stops. Even though the whole world around him is chaos and people are saying, hurry up, we got to go, she's dying, Jesus stops. And he puts all of his attention on her, just her. And while everyone else sees problems, Jesus sees a person, and he gives her his presence. You see, it's really easy to read a story in Luke chapter 8 and think, well, I can't apply that. I can't do miracles. I can't heal people. I can't reverse sickness and death. And yet, you can apply the story. Because what you can do is what Jesus did. You can offer the gift of presence to the people around you. In fact, I would argue that your presence is the greatest gift you can offer somebody else. Another way of saying this is what people really need from you is your undivided attention. And the good news is you actually have this ability. Like, you don't have to go to school for it. You don't have to be a therapist to do this. This is what my friend Jim did for me years ago. He just offered me the gift of undivided attention, non-judgmental, loving, kind, compassionate, unhurried attention. And this guy's busy. He was speaking at the very seminar in which he listened to me, and yet he wasn't in a hurry. He just sat there and he listened to me. Sustained, genuine interest, and it was a gift. And you have this gift. But the greatest hindrance to you offering this gift to other people is actually your phone. Because it's really hard to give somebody else your undivided attention when your attention is divided. Constantly responding to every single buzz and every single ding that happens on your phone. So rampant that there's a phrase for it. It's called phone snubbing, or the shorthand for it is phubbing. So the University of Baylor actually did a study on this, and they have identified 8 characteristics of phone snubbing or phubbing. I won't read you all 8 because a lot of them are similar, but I'll read you 4 of them. So here's 4 of the characteristics from this study. Number 1, halting face-to-face conversations when the phone buzzes or rings. Number 2, checking your phone during mealtime. Number 3, using phone the moment a lull in conversation begins, which we all do this. Number 4, placing your cell phone on the table to see it while with other people. Got a bunch of people, and they tested them over the course of a few months about how much were they practicing phone snubbing behaviors, and then how did that affect the health of their relationships. So here was the concluding sentence of the study. If you hit the next one here. The more phubbing behaviors one had, the more likely they were to experience conflict in the relationship and have lower levels of satisfaction. So what this means is, over the long haul, if you respond to every single buzz and every single ding, what this means is your friendships actually deteriorate and your relationships suffer and your marriage actually gets worse. If I can pause right here and say a brief word, especially, the series is for all of us, but right now I especially want to talk to everybody like college and younger. I actually am concerned that you are over time losing your ability to have interpersonal relationships with other people. This addiction is so strong. I want to tell you an extreme example. About 6-7 years ago, there was a college student that I had a relationship with. This college student had recently got married. His father-in-law was very sick. And one day, out of the blue, he texts me and he says, "Phil, I'm at the hospital and they're saying it's about time." And then a few minutes later, he says, "Phil, I think he's taking his final breath." And then a few minutes later, "No, Phil, this is the final breath." "Well, wait, Phil, I think this is his final breath." Text messages. Now, I responded really nice and compassionately to him, but what I wanted to say was, put your phone down. You're experiencing, yes, on the one hand, one of the saddest things you can experience, which is being by someone when they pass away. But it's also one of the most deeply profound experiences you'll ever have. You need to put your phone down. And a lot of us, what we're doing is because we are so addicted to every ding and buzz of the phone, we have lost the ability to simply be where we are and to be fully alive and present in the moment. And if you choose to try this out, if you choose to be present to other people like Jesus was in the story, I want to share with you one more thing. The gift of presence demands the best of your energy. In other words, it's not easy. It's actually very hard to be fully present to somebody else. In fact, look back at the story. Verse 45, Jesus says this, "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." Like, there's people everywhere, Jesus. But Jesus said, "Someone has touched me." And I love this phrase here. "I know that power has gone out from me." Power has gone out from me. You see, every interaction that Jesus had with people came at a cost. He was giving of himself. We forget that he was fully human. And interactions with people drained him just like they drain you and me. Every interaction came at a cost. It's the same with you and me. When we are fully present to somebody else, this is not a passive act. It requires our full energy and attention. I recently read a book about friendship. One of my favorite quotes of the whole book was this: "To be present to you means I must be temporarily absent to me." In other words, I can't think about me if I'm fully going to focus on you. When you can be disciplined and not respond to every single ding and buzz from your phone, then what happens is you can profoundly bless somebody else. And for many of you, it's the best gift you can give somebody. Your undivided attention is the greatest gift that you can give somebody else. So many people in the world are starting to realize the power of presence. Jill Nichols sent me this story a few months ago, and it was pretty stunning to me. So in 2010, there was an artist called Maria Abramovic, and she arranged one of the strangest art displays ever seen. She went to the Museum of Modern Art in New York, and she set up 2 chairs in the museum on this very large rectangle. You can put that next picture up there. So this is what the display looked like. And what she would do is she would invite people to come sit across the table from her. And the rules were there would be no speaking. It would be total silence. But the promise she made to whoever would sit across from her was that she would offer this person her full attention, her loving, gentle, non-judgmental attention. And that was it. And the person could sit there as long as they wanted. Well, this was quite a risk both for her and the museum. It was a risk for her because she was going to be sitting for long periods of time. It was a risk to the museum because they didn't know if this was going to bring in foot traffic or money, but they went ahead and let her do the display. Well, at first, very few people came in because it was a pretty strange. And yet, as the days and the weeks rolled on, more and more people showed up. I want you to see these pictures of a few of the kinds of people that showed up. Children, elderly, men, women, they just wanted to sit in the presence of somebody else. And one of the strangest things happened. People only sat there for 4 or 5 minutes on average, but more often than not, even though there were no words spoken, the people that sat in front of her began to cry. There was just something powerful about being in the presence of somebody else. And with no words to use as defense mechanisms, they were simply left to themselves and to sit in the presence of somebody who cared about them. And so many of these people ended up crying. As the weeks went on, more and more people learned about this, and people began traveling from all over the country to sit in Maria's presence. People, in the final weeks of the demonstration, it got so popular that the line went outside the museum. People began spending the night outside the museum just so they could get to be at the front of the line the next day. All in all, she spent 736 hours sitting in silent presence in front of other people, and over 1,500 people sat in that chair. People would travel for miles away and wait in lines for hours of presence. See, our world is starving for presence. Your friends are starving for presence. Your family is, your Bible class is, and the good news is you can offer this gift to the world. So let me ask you one more time. Do you have the discipline to turn your phone off for 24 hours? This week, if you feel moved to, I really challenge you to do that, and I hope you can join us this Saturday for FaceTime when we give the gift of presence to each other. I want to read a final quote to end this sermon, and this also the final quote to end this series. Andy Crouch has written a lot in the last decade or two about culture making. So he's really a big leading thinker on how to change culture. He wrote a book about technology. It's a really good book. This is his final paragraph of the whole book. He says this: "We are meant to build the kind of life that at the end is completely dependent on one another. The kind of life that ultimately transcends and does not need the easy solutions of technology because it is caught up in something more true and more lasting than any alchemy our technological world can invent. We are meant to be family, not just marriages bound by vows and the children that come from them, but a wider family that invites others into our lives and even to the threshold of our very last breath to experience vulnerability and grace, sorrow and hope, singing our way homeward." This next part's so important. We were meant not just for thin, virtual connections, but for visceral, real connections to one another in this fleeting, temporary, and infinitely beautiful and worthwhile life. We are meant to die in one another's arms, surrounded by prayer and song, knowing beyond knowing that we are loved. And you need to know this morning that you are loved. You're loved by your Father in heaven, and you're loved by this church. And so if you need something from this church family this morning, whether that be prayer or baptism, I invite you to come while we stand and sing.